Welcome to the Stone Carving and Lettering Takeaway. I'm Charlotte Howarth.
And I'm Nina Bilby with a very, very festive, sexy chest infection voice, which is what happens on the 1st of December generally with me. How are you, Charlotte?
I'm pretty good. Busy with work, but other than that, pretty good. Looking forward to having a few days off soon. Anyway, we've got a very festive podcast, haven't we? It's our gift to all of our listeners.
Yes, we thought everybody out there in their cold workshops deserved a very special interview, and that's exactly what we're about to deliver.
So we have got a fabulous interview with Peter Randall Page, a really well-known international profile sculptor, and he very generously gave us quite a lot of his time to talk about his work and his approach to working with stone, carving stone, and his views. It was absolutely brilliant. And so what we've done is because it's quite a long interview and we didn't want to cut any of it out, so we have cut it into two parts. And so we thought as a festive gift, we'd give you a two-parter interview with Peter Randall Page to listen to at leisure over the festive period.
Peter is an extraordinary sculptor, primarily working in granite and stone, but he also is a prolific drawer using ink and pencil graphite. So if you have a chance to look at his work while you listen to the interview, I strongly recommend that to connect what he's saying to the work that he's produced. And he is somebody that we were absolutely thrilled to interview, because if you look him up online, you can listen and watch interviews of Peter, but this was a very personal interview, and he was very generous with his reflections on his life, his long career and his life in stone. So if anybody out there is interested in the less figurative elements of sculpture in stone specifically, and more a kind of humanitarian view of nature and repeated patterns especially, I would strongly recommend you look and listen to this interview, which we're really proud of.
Yeah, and we'll put a link to Peter's webpage in the show notes.
Yeah.
And anyway, here is the first part of the Peter Randall Page interview. So listen and enjoy. We are delighted to welcome our guest today, Peter Randall Page, and thank you so much for giving us the time to talk to us today.
It's quite unbelievable that we're sitting here talking to you. So we're absolutely thrilled. Thank you, Peter. It's a real honour to do this.
Great pleasure. It's a great pleasure. Thank you for asking
me. Our podcast is aimed at people who work in stone, so carvers, masons, letter cutters. And we've got a bit of an audience of people who work on their own and people who work in workshops. So our questions today are focused on your stone practice, if you like. And I'd like to start off with asking you where your interest in stone started. And I know that you were at Wells Cathedral for a period of time, and whether it started there or whether it was prior to that.
No, it was prior to that. It actually started when I was a student at Bath Academy of Art, where I worked actually in lots of different materials, but latterly, partly probably because Bath is an area where there's stone around, I got interested in working with stone. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. I was attracted to working with stone because, in a way, although it can be a very complex process in many ways, the concept of stone carving is delightfully simple. You just take off the bits you don't like and leave on the bits that you do like. And I like the fact also that it's a kind of, the stone is already a thing. It's not like a blank sheet of paper. It's not like that terrifying blank sheet of paper for an artist. It's already something. And even before you've done anything to it, you've kind of rolled it over and maybe taken some corners off to make it easier to do that and various things. So it's kind of, it's a dialogue between, it's actually a dialogue with oneself, but using the stone as a kind of sounding board, if you like. And I always have favoured, or I've come to favour, ways of working where thought and action are almost united in the working process. So one's making a kind of decision, acting on it, and then responding to that action, and then making another decision. And I like processes where it's very fluid. I mean, stone carving has that in common with drawing and painting and modeling. all traditional ways of working. But for me, they have the advantage that one can work in quite the working process tends to generate a kind of unself-conscious way of responding to your feelings, because thought and action become almost fused in the working process. So that's kind of important. Also, I like the fact that it's a one-way process. Unless you start using stone glue and sticking bits back on or assembling things, it's very different to a constructivist sort of way of working, where you make a decision, then you go away and you cut the metal or you do whatever you have to do. You put it together, and that all takes time, and then you make an appraisal, and then you do something else. I love the fact that it sort of rolls along, and you're almost unself-conscious about the decisions you're making. Also, in the sense of it being a one-way process, it's a bit like life. You can't sort of just say, "Oh, I wish I hadn't chipped that bit off. I wish I hadn't done that." You have to carry on forwards and inwards in the case of stone carving, and redeem what you don't feel happy with by moving forward. And philosophically, that kind of appeals to me as well. So towards the end of my time at Bath Academy of Art, I really got very involved in stone carving, and I suppose those are the kind of some of the factors that attracted me.
Was there a tutor there, or was it something you discovered for yourself at the college?
I think it's something I kind of discovered for myself, really. There were very few people working. I mean, it was in the 1970s, conceptual art and performance art and all sorts of things. I had always been interested in object making, and I'd spent a lot of time at places like the British Museum, in the Egyptian Monumental Room, and then what was the Ethnographical Museum around the back of Burlington House. I think that the idea of expressing oneself by making objects and showing them to people, which might seem a quite clumsy way of communicating in an age of when not only have we got verbal communication, but we've got all sorts of other ways of communicating. But for me, it does deal with a particular area of human experience which no other way of working does, making objects. And for a lack of a better way of saying it, it's the kind of direct, unedited experience of inhabiting a physical body in a physical world. And that always appealed to me, that sort of directness.
And how did you go? So did you go to the Bath Academy directly from school, or did you do a foundation? You went to school then?
No, I didn't. I left school at 16, and then I wasn't very successful at school. I was very dyslexic. That's partly why I think, observation of things and making things was my way of understanding the world, because although I was interested in lots of things, it wasn't accessible to me as a child very much through reading, because I was a very poor reader. I mean, subsequently, I've become a very avid reader, but as a child, I found it extremely difficult.
I was going to say, did you find a love of drawing at college as well? Were you encouraged? We're all like life. Sometimes when you're at that age and you're introduced to drawing medium and life drawing, etc. Is that where your love of drawing came from, or did that come later?
I always drew. My father was a sort of diorama maker and a model maker, and worked in a shed in the garden. And he was a great draftsman and a painter, and he made dioramas. And I don't know if you know what they are. You don't see them very much these days, but it's where you've got a sort of painted back. Yes, that's right. They used to be for museums and that sort of. Yeah. So I grew up with that, and I grew up drawing all the time, looking at things, looking at natural objects particularly, and making drawings and making sort of studies of things. So
it sounds like drawing was something that was valued in your household.
Oh, definitely. My dad drew the whole time, and it was a very natural way of explaining things, and still is. Well, my dad's not around anymore, but my son is a really good draftsman. He's an architect, but I mean, and we work together quite a lot, and we communicate a lot of ideas through drawing, even if it's just on the back of an envelope or something. But I was lucky at Bath Academy of Art in that, although lots of people doing things which had nothing to do with drawing and making, essentially, they still had the facility for things like life drawing, still life drawing, and observational drawing and so on was still valued. And if you wanted to tap into that, it was certainly available to tap into.
And so the journey to Wells, I was really surprised to see that you'd gone. So were you at a mason's yard at Wells, or was it a conservation practice? Or
it was a conservation practice. It was sort of associated with the mason's yard. I wanted, leaving college, I wanted to find ways of, obviously earning some money, which was still connected with sculpture and would, would advance my interest in objects and sculpture and making things. And at that time, probably the same applies even more now. There was a lot of study about immediately contemporary and recent sculpture, and to some extent in art history going back to the Renaissance, but very, very little, if any, study of medieval sculpture. So it was a whole world of sculpture right on my doorstep, which in a way I was not completely unaware of, because I'd always loved cathedrals and churches, but it was a real privilege to be able to work up on that west front of Wells Cathedral and get close to some of these wonderful medieval 13th century sculptures and really be able to study them and work with them. And I was involved mainly with conservation of the statuary, the wonderful drapery, which was a huge influence on me, almost like a kind of abstract form, and also has that sense of one thing overlaying another. So you kind of sense the flesh underneath the drapery in the same way as you sense the sort of bones underneath the flesh, and this sense of layering, and just a very, very expressive form in an almost abstract way. And likewise with the foliage carving, which I came to really think of as a kind of rationalization of growth, sort of those wonderful stiff leaf carvings. And so I did get a chance to work with copying some of the medieval capitals and finials and that sort of thing, and also working with conserving the drapery and all that kind of stuff at Wells. I felt very privileged to be there. There's a man called Professor Robert Baker, who developed all the techniques about working to conserve limestone using lime and limestone dust, which at the time was quite revolutionary. There had been a lot of use of salines and that kind of thing, which were chemicals, which actually ended up doing more harm than good to the statues, because it's all very well hardening something up by injecting or stuff into it, but it has to be completely dry. And if you've got a small object, you can put it in a kiln and make it completely dry and then soak it in something to harden it up. But with an object that's outdoors and is quite large, you can never do that. So these chemicals would soak in, an inch or something. And then the coefficient of expansion in the treated material and the untreated would cause them to fracture and bits to it did much more harm than good in the long run. Whereas Professor Baker had these techniques all to do with lime and to do with making very specialist kind of lime mortars in order to effect repairs onto the stone itself, and then lime washes and that kind of thing. So it was a great training and very, very fascinating, mainly to spend that time with those amazing carvings and to realize that the wonderful understated nature of the carvings was very much to do with the fact they were designed to be painted. So you could really see how the folds and the drapery would accept a sort of brush into those things, and all the relief was created in that way, rather than making really deep, heavy incisions, as the Victorians did once they'd sort of cleaned the remains of the paint off the statues. So that was really, really, really fascinating, and a great kind of lesson. And I was lucky also because Robert Baker was he was quite a formidable character, but he trained actually as a ceramicist and as an artist, and he valued drawing enormously. So in my interview, I had to, it was quite alarming, really. They sat me down with I think a bunch of flowers or a bowl of fruit or something. and part of my interview was to sit there and draw in front of all these rather,
with an
rather
audience.
important audience, which was a bit daunting. But the wonderful thing was we were given every Friday where we weren't expected to work on the cathedral itself. We were expected to be there, and you could either draw from the cathedral or you could draw from nature. Which
Wow,
is very
that's
enlightening.
amazing. So forward thinking, isn't it?
You were kind of paid.
Investing in you and your knowledge. Amazing.
You were paid for a 5-day week, but one day you just were paid to draw.
Did you have to produce what you'd done to prove the point? Did they critique it?
No. Occasionally he wanted to have a look at your sketchbook or something, but no, it wasn't formal in that way. So it wasn't. You didn't feel intimidated and like you've got to produce the most wonderful, wonderful drawing. You just had to be drawing.
Investigating. That's so fantastic.
He believed very strongly that if you were going to be a good conservator or a good stone, carver, drawing was pretty fundamental, and I've always agreed with that.
So if we, both Charlotte and I, listened to the really fascinating interview you did with Roger Kneebone, and you talked to the importance of working within a framework to help with the creative process, and both Charlotte and I are big believers in that the old adage that it's the mistakes that you make through your career that makes you a good craftsperson or maker, and it's how you manage mistakes, but you have to have that framework of understanding and investigation, like you were talking about before. So could you, how does that lead into your own practice now? And it feels like it's been from the beginning that you've had these kind of you've got these physical boundaries where you're working from the outside edge in to produce your work, or in stone at least. And also I feel like also you give yourself a framework of paper on your drawings, and you give yourself a framework of almost a limited palette of materials as well. So talk about, could you tell us about that?
Okay, well, I suppose my practice has always been kind of informed and inspired by a long, very informal study of natural phenomena generally, and right from childhood, sort of looking at nature and start to begin with just doing observational drawing and just trying to work out how patterns work, how things fit together, and the nature of patterns in the natural world being absolutely pervasive. And so that's been very important, has become more and more important all the way through my working life. But balancing that fantastic sense of variation, the idea of that, no two leaves are the same, although you recognize an oak leaf as an oak leaf. No two pebbles are the same, although you recognize a pebble as a pebble. You will never find two the same, the same way. No two clouds are the same, although we categorize them into different categories like cumulonimbus and all that. But within that, there's a seemingly infinite variety of variation. But that is obviously, but beneath all that, you do get the sense when you look at things for a long time of underlying principles on which these things are making these wonderful infinite propensity for infinite pattern formation. The kind of the tendency for pattern formation is always mitigated by an equally strong tendency for random variation. So there's the concept of theme and variation has become extremely important for me. It's obviously a term we normally associate with music, but I think one sees it everywhere in the natural world. And if things were only pattern formation, then it would be, there would be it would be stasis. It was just pattern repeating and repeating and repeating. But it seems that the universe we live in is incapable of producing perfect copies of anything. You recognize them as being part of a kind of family of forms, but they're never, ever identical. And in a sense, when you think about the evolutionary process, that's what drives the evolutionary process. If it was only repetition and pattern formation, then it would be stasis. Nothing would change, nothing would evolve. So it's this tendency for the mutation in biological terms that actually drives the evolutionary process, and that's become a very important concept for me. And I suppose when one thinks about parameters, working within parameters, it's the variation in a way that makes life fascinating and endlessly interesting. And in music, certainly, and in literature and in art, and in every kind of human activity, as well as in the natural world, both organic and inorganic, it's that sense of almost like I mean, without being too anthropomorphic about it, it's almost as if nature had a sense of a what if sort of feeling of playfulness, of a kind of playfulness, which in human terms we think of as playfulness. And playfulness, rather than, I mean, I think when I was younger, I was just fascinated by looking at patterns and seeing how they worked. And then as time went on, I realized that there's this kind of dynamic tension in the natural world, in natural phenomena between, as I say, a tendency for spontaneous pattern formation, combined with this sense of random variation, which is the kind of, in a way, the sort of joy of life. But you do need the structure in order to play, which is a very important concept for me in my work. Playfulness and invention and improvisation is vital, as far as I'm concerned, in making art. If you only have, you do need parameters. I mean, football without a finite pitch and without a set of rules would be neither interesting to play or interesting to watch. So you do need to create a playground to play in. And I suppose that's what I was talking about with Roger.
I was just going to say, as a letterer, I loved that description, because lettering is all about parameters. But obviously within that, there's an infinite way of changing them and using them as a form of expression. And I'll probably just kick in here with the one and the many, because it seems the right moment for me is with I always think of lettering as predominantly as pattern making, as well as text based. And I just loved the one and the many. If people aren't familiar with it, it's a beautiful, huge boulder carved with different texts from all over the world about creation. And I mean, I was just, when I first came across it, I was enthralled and fascinated by it. And what I loved, it looks so effortless, because it's got a regularity to the pattern that just works. And I just wondered, is lettering something you've done much of, or did you need lots of help? How did you go about doing that? Because it looks seamless, but as somebody who does lettering, I know it's a really complex process.
No, I mean, that's really good questions. I mean, I think, just backpedaling a tiny bit, obviously language, as we know, evolves. We hear it evolve, even in a lifetime. Language, verbal language, as does written language, the actual forms of letters. And I think that's another wonderful example of the way in which a kind of cultural evolution develops, as it does with stories. They evolve, and they, the bits that have real human resonance remain, and the ones that don't sort of fall away, and you end up with this wonderful distillation of stories which become iconic in a sort of metaphorical way. And I've always loved all that. So I've always been interested. I mean, I suppose the one and the many, in some ways, lots of people look at it and think, gosh, this is a bit of an aberration, a bit of a one-off, which it is to some extent, although it does draw on a lot of things that I've been interested in all my life. And the thing it has in common with a lot of my work, which doesn't involve lettering or writing patterns, or but it does have the thing in common that it is sort of marks on a random form. I mean, I've done a lot of work which is applying patterns to random boulders in various ways with a simple set of rules. It's a continuous line which covers the whole surface in this kind of even way and responds to the given shape, the sort of shape which is nothing to do with, an eroded granite boulder, which the one and the many is. I love the fact it's got absolutely nothing to do with not only human beings, it doesn't even have anything to do with organic life, really. It's got how it was, how it is, through an innumerable number of chance events in a kind of geological timescale, which is way beyond anything that we have any control over. And I love the fact of responding to that. So it's got that, one of the men has got that in common with lots of other things I've done. It was a lovely project to do. I got really absorbed in it. You know, I'm not a letter cutter. It's a very specialist thing, as you all know only too well. It's something, you know, and it's something I wouldn't ever dream of thinking that I had any expertise in at all. But what I did get very involved with was all these different, and I had to be, you know, I made parameters about it. So I didn't include pictograms and I didn't include hieroglyphics. I wanted them to be just sort of marks, abstract marks, which obviously bring with them, you know, infinite range of meanings. And the kind of a huge variety of different kind of mark making that human beings can do. And again, the variations within that theme of just making marks within a sort of either right to left or left to right, or the ones that go right to left and then left to right.
Something to do with an ox, I think.
Yeah, something to do with ploughing. It's to do with ploughing. And some go from top to bottom, some go left to right, some go from, you know, bottom to top, right to left. And I was fascinated by all that. And also I wanted to tie it in with another fascination of mine, which is the fascination with creation stories. I mean, every culture has creation stories. Some have loads of different ones. And I think that's quite a uniquely human thing, because I think once one's aware of mortality and you realize there are endings, which I don't think other animals are aware of until it happens, their own death and so on, or certainly don't dwell on these things. But once you have this sort of double-edged sword of consciousness, which means that you do realize that everything is going to end, including one's own life, then you do start thinking quite naturally about, well, if there's ends, there must be beginnings. And I think the thing of creation stories just reveals such a lot about the human nature and our longings and fears and all of things that we think about and dream about. So it's a great rich source of imaginative thinking and imagining. And I was lucky, I had a very good researcher working with me. And as I say, I didn't do musical notation. I didn't tackle mathematical notation. It was all to do with sort of verbal meaning translated into mark making. Narrowed it down. Well, a bit. I mean, my God, certainly not narrow. But I had a great researcher, and we tried to look at deal with the main families of sort of ways of putting language into mark making.
But when I listened to you talk on the TED Talk about the theme of variation, I could see it for me as somebody who does letters. I completely saw that in that piece. You know, it's all about human expression. It's about the theme of variation, of which this is what I understood. The mark, you know, the way the different marks, you know, there's a consistency to them and a huge difference to them as well. I thought it is a seamlessly beautiful piece of lettered work, and you rarely see that.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I can't take credit for the letter cutting because I had a very good team of 3 people, one of whom was a very experienced letter cutter. One was Ben Jones. Ben was great. I mean, he was fantastic. He was really great. But what I did do was, you can imagine this is a great big random shaped thing, and I wanted to cover the entire surface. So there was an awful lot of making little strips of paper, you know, measuring the girth at a certain place.
Oh, I know. Yeah. Well, it's really difficult, I think, to fit, because that's about pattern, it's the pattern, the repetition, the rhythm of the marks, and they happen to be letters, but they're still abstract as well, and getting them all to fit in so that the rhythm and the pattern is working is no easy feat.
Well, that was a major part of the job for me, was doing that, and I ended up with all these strips of paper stuck around, shuffling things around, measuring. And also I divided it to begin with vertically into the golden proportion. Vertically.
Yes.
So I went from horizontal to vertical to horizontal to vertical, or I can't remember exactly, but they were in a kind of nice proportional way. And then it was fitting things into that. And what I did do was to paint every single letter form, writing system, onto the stone with a little tiny brush. So I worked my way around and worked out exactly how things would fit. I didn't want to have gaps, and I wanted them all to sort of interlock or fit together. And I painted, and this was months of work. You can imagine with a tiny brush, it looks slightly ridiculous, but there this enormous stone. A lot of spell checking. I had to get people, I had to get Chinese people and experts in, Greek and in cuneiform and all sorts of things to make sure I wasn't saying something really ridiculous or rude. So hopefully I didn't make any real gaffes. But yes, it was quite a task, but it was a fantastic, in a way, it was a fantastic education for me in drawing, in mark making, in the possibilities of mark making, in quite apart from the meanings of the language systems, just in the kind of variations of mark making within certain quite strict parameters, because they're all, most of them are within a certain sort of oblong shape, and also choosing. I mean, quite apart from that, in an earlier stage, actually choosing the stories, because there's so many stories apart from so many writing systems, and then choosing the passages from those stories which seemed the most relevant and the most that actually summed up something about what the culture was saying about what they believed about the language system, about the creation of the universe. So many of them, you found things which resonated between completely disparate cultures. There were lots of things about gods and goddesses creating the world from bits of their own body. There were lots and lots of things from disparate cultures from different parts of the world with no cultural connection about gods and goddesses making men and women out of mud or clay and then breathing life into them, which is and just wonderful poetic imagery like that, which was such a delight. But it was almost impossible to edit. So I really was very grateful to have the help of my wonderful young research assistant, Ashlyn McNamara, who just was brilliant. And she really looked out lots of things, and then together we would go through and choose passages, and then once we'd chosen a passage we liked the meaning of, then it was a matter of how on earth you made that fit into however many lines at whatever point on the object itself. I mean, it was great fun. Thank God I had a deadline, because you could have gone on doing it forever.
Can I ask how long it took in total? Did you instigate this project, or was it a commissioning project? Or
no, I instigated. Well, I know it was I was asked to come up with an idea for a sculpture for that place, where the old Middlesex Hospital used to be, and I came up with the concept. There was no concept in the brief at all, except they did say, that part of London, Fitzroy, has always been a very cosmopolitan part of town. And I suppose, I thought, cosmopolitan part of town. And then it just triggered these ideas, and it went from there, really. But there was no brief which had anything to do with writing systems or creation stories or anything like that.
And how long from start to finish do you think?
Wow, I'm not sure. It's probably about, I can't remember, 9 months, maybe a year.
Wow, I thought you were going to say 2 or 3 years.
That's
I had
nothing.
no idea. Wow, that's
But
extraordinary.
as I say, I had these great letter cutters and I had a great researcher. I mean, I've got reams and reams and reams. I've got files full of bits of paper and with letter forms and creation stories and God knows what. Because it was, yes, it was, you know, so many different aspects to it. The meaning of the text, you know, the visual look of the text, the way in which the text would fit together with the horizontals and verticals and so on. And it's the only sculpture I've ever made which had its own dedicated website. I don't know if you've been able to see the website.
Both,
Yeah. It was down for a long time because when the thing was decommissioned, the whole development, the new owners just kind of let it slip, and it was quite a job to rediscover the. I mean, I sort of I didn't make the website myself because I can hardly turn the computer on and off, but I did orchestrate that. And as you know, you can revolve the object in virtual space and then point on bits, and it'll give you information about the culture that the script comes from and the translation of the creation story itself.
So we hope you enjoyed that.
That was quite extraordinary, wasn't it? We've managed to kind of find a natural gap in that interview, and we hope that Charlotte and I both have worked through the festive season up to Christmas Day and through Christmas. Might have actually worked through Christmas Day now and again. And that kind of strange quiet period between Christmas and New Year, where lots of other people who might be on a salary might be enjoying time off, but the rest of us and the freelance, the freelance working sculptors will be working through that kind of quietly peaceful period. So hopefully when you've got a moment and you're bored of mince pies and your turkey roast dinner soup is going cold in the flask, you'll be able to listen to the second part and enjoy the rest of it.
And I also have a top tip for the period of quiet and contemplation ahead of us. So if you do find that you have some extra time and you're looking for a half an hour, 40 minutes to kill it, then I'm going to recommend the online lecture series that you can now download from Letter Exchange. So if you're not familiar with Letter Exchange, it's an organization for anybody who's interested in the use of letters in all their different mediums and varieties. And for many years, as long as I can remember, I think since, over 30 years, I've been attending their lectures at the Art Workers Guild in London. But for the last few years, they have begun recording, videoing these lectures and putting them online for people to access. So for a small fee of, I can't remember what it is, £7 or something, £5, you can go online and you can choose a lecture from their archive and watch it. And they're absolutely brilliant. I'd really recommend having a look if you're interested in letters. I'll put a link in the notes. So it's letterexchange.org. And it's an absolutely brilliant resource for people who are interested in lettering of all types. So do look them up if you're not familiar and go on and choose some of their fabulous lectures to watch. So with that, we shall say this is the stone carving and lettering takeaway. If you are enjoying listening to our podcast, then hit follow or subscribe. And if you'd like to drop us a line and say, ask us a question or give us a top tip you'd like us to share, then our email is info@abraxasacademy.co.uk. And happy chipping.
Happy chipping. Bugger.